The United States owns a weapon that has never fired a single shot. It has no explosives and no soldiers, and over the past 20 years, it has changed more government's behavior than any aircraft carrier. It works like this. You are simply disconnected from money. Your bank cannot pay anyone, and nobody can pay you. But this weapon has a strange property. It only works while it stays in the holster. Every time it is drawn, it gets a little weaker. And last Saturday, one more country quietly started building its way out. This is not really a story about the dollar, and it is not a story about China. It is a story about what happens to any place that everyone is forced to pass through. On Saturday, the 19th of July in Beijing, the governor of the Central Bank of Libya, Naji Issa, met the governor of the People's Bank of China, Pan Gongsheng. They agreed to connect Libya's commercial banks to a Chinese system called CEPR, the cross-border interbank payment system. Libyan banks will also be able to get Chinese banks to guarantee their trade deals, the paperwork that lets an exporter ship goods knowing he will be paid, and Libya's central bank will start parking some of its savings in Chinese government debt. It is worth being precise here, because this kind of story attracts exaggeration. Nothing has switched on yet. No Libyan bank appears on the list of CEPR participants, and the two sides are still planning a banking forum for early next year. What was signed is an intention, not a finished plumbing job. CEPR itself is real enough, though. It already reaches banks in more than 180 countries, and this March, it moved a record $1.25 trillion yuan, around $180 billion in a single day. And yet, quietly, the interesting part of this news is Libya. Because Libya is not being punished, not being pressured, and not at war with Washington. It is simply the latest country to decide that having only one way to move money is a risk worth spending money to fix. To see why this matters, you need to know how a payment between two countries actually travels. And it is simpler than it sounds. Say a company in Libya pays a supplier in Vietnam. Two things have to happen. First, the banks have to talk. This account, this amount. That messaging runs on a network called SWIFT, which connects more than 11,000 banks around the world. Think of it as the postal service between banks. It carries the instructions, but it never carries the money. Second, the money itself has to move. Banks do not ship cash to each other, so instead they keep accounts with each other, the way you keep an account at your bank. And because almost every bank in the world needs to handle dollars, almost every bank keeps a dollar account inside an American bank. So the Libyan bank's dollars and the Vietnamese bank's dollars both sit in New York. And the payment is really just a number moving between two accounts there. That second step is the interesting one. Even though neither the buyer nor the seller is American, the payment still passes through the American banking system because that is where the dollars actually sit. And that means it passes within reach of American law. So when Washington sanctions a bank, it doesn't need to send anyone anywhere. It tells American banks this account is closed. The messages may still arrive, but the money stops. That is the whole weapon, Here is where the design starts working against itself. A choke point gives you power because everyone has to pass through it. But this weapon is unlike any other. A gun is just as dangerous after you fire it. This one is not. Every time it is used, the country on the receiving end has to find another route. And once it finds one, that country is out of reach for good. It also becomes a customer for somebody else's system. And every new customer makes that rival system a little more useful to everyone else. Watch the sequence. In 2012, the United States and Europe cut Iran's banks off from the dollar system. Iran went looking for workarounds, and so did anyone trading with Iran. Then came the bigger moment. Every country keeps savings for emergencies, and most of those savings are not in a vault at home. They sit as dollars and euros in banks abroad. In 2022, after the invasion of Ukraine, Western governments froze around $300 billion of Russia's savings. Officials in every other country noticed the same thing at the same time. Money you keep abroad is only yours until someone else decides otherwise. Russia shifted its trade into China's currency, the yuan, and joined CEPS, not out of affection for Beijing, but because it had nothing else left. And then countries that were never sanctioned started watching. Central banks bought gold, which no one can switch off. Libya's central bank booked a flight to Beijing. Nobody in this chain is behaving irrationally. Each step is somebody protecting themselves. Now, this is the point where a lot of videos would tell you the dollar is collapsing. It is not, and the numbers are worth looking at honestly. The dollar's share of the world's savings has indeed fallen a long way, from about 72% in 2001 to roughly 57% today. But in the first quarter of this year, it went up, not down. The Chinese yuan, meanwhile, is tiny. It makes up about 2% of the world's reserves and about 3% of payments. And when anyone anywhere swaps one currency for another, the dollar is one of the two currencies involved nearly 90% of the time. And there are economists who argue the sanction story is largely wrong. Research published through the Center for Economic Policy Research finds no clear statistical link between sanctions and the dollar's decline. They say the drop has simpler causes. The dollar's price moves against other currencies, which changes the percentages on paper, and countries have been spreading their savings around a bit more, the way any careful saver would. Their strongest argument is a good one. Sanctions are usually imposed together with Europe, Britain, and Japan. So the euro, the pound, and the yen are no refuge from Washington either. Notice what that argument is and is not about. It is about the dollar's share of the world's savings, and on that, they are probably right. It is not about how many countries have built themselves a second route, and that number only moves one way. So the honest claim is narrower than the headlines. The dollar is not falling. The leverage is thinning. So what would a system look like that doesn't spend itself down? There are three designs worth putting side by side, and none of them is free. The first is simply doing it with other people. Compare two moments. In 2012, the United States and Europe sanctioned Iran together, and Iran's banks were cut off with everyone's agreement. There was nowhere to run because the exits were closed too. In 2018, the United States walked out of the agreement that had limited Iran's nuclear program. Europe wanted to stay in it. So Washington warned European companies that if they kept trading with Iran, they would lose their own access to the American banking system. That was the moment Europe, an ally, started designing a way around it. The trade-off is real, and it is time. Getting 27 European governments to agree is slow, and the sanction that finally emerges is usually weaker. It buys weaker punishment today in exchange for allies who stay inside the system tomorrow. The second design is to build your own pipe. Europe actually tried this. In 2019, France, Germany, and Britain created a mechanism called Instex, meant to let European companies keep trading with Iran without touching the American system. It processed essentially one transaction, and it was shut down in 2023. The failure is more instructive than a success would have been. The technology was never the hard part. Payment systems run on habit and scale. A new pipe is worthless unless enough banks are already using it, and the banks did the maths. On one side of the scale was a small amount of Iranian trade. On the other side was their access to the dollar, and therefore to most of the world economy. They chose the dollar, and their governments could not make them choose otherwise. And that tells you something about how much time the choke point has left. Building a way around it is slow and expensive, which is why so few have managed it. But slow is not the same as never. The third design gives up on the choke point entirely. Instead of one dominant rail with alternatives slowly growing around it, you build a world with several from the start. There is already a working prototype called M-Bridge. It was built by the central bank's own bank in Switzerland, together with the central banks of China, Thailand, the United Arab Emirates, and Hong Kong. Alongside it, dozens of countries are building digital versions of their own currencies. In that world, no one can be switched off. That sounds like good news, and it is also exactly the problem. Financial sanctions are the main tool the world has for punishing a government without shooting at it. Cutting a country off has stopped wars from being financed and has forced governments to the table. Take away the choke point, and you take that away too, not just from Washington, but from any future coalition that would rather sanction an aggressor than fight one. So this is not the clean, happy ending. It is a genuine exchange, less vulnerability to being cut off, and fewer ways to stop someone without violence. Which brings us back to the holster. The strange thing about a choke point is that its power is measured by how much of the world has no alternative, and using it is precisely what gives people a reason to find one. Using it costs something every time, but that cost never shows up on anyone's desk. Each decision to draw the weapon can be completely reasonable on its own, and the bill still arrives. Libya's agreement changes almost nothing on its own. Nothing has switched on, and the WAN remains a rounding error next to the dollar. But it is one more line on a map, drawn by a country that nobody was punishing, which is exactly the kind of line that tells you where a system is heading. The question worth watching is not whether the dollar falls, it is how often the weapon gets drawn.